Hello, friends and enemies. Today we are going to talk about a very special compilation album. This one is Altar of Shadows, released by Oakland-based indie label Psychic Eye. The album is formally released on CD today, May 22, 2022, in case you see this later, with May 22nd being World Goth Day, though I and everyone else who pre-ordered it had access to it on stream before then, hence why I was able to listen to it and able to talk about it now. Now, why am I talking about this compilation from Oakland, a city from the very much not Latin American country of the United States? Well, my official excuse, other than I just like this album, is that there are in fact 4 of the 18 songs on this compilation that are of bands from Latin American countries. 3, Diablo Strain, Vacuum, and Delirium Mask from Chile, and 1, Okvlta from Colombia. That's what, a fifth of the album? A fourth? Somewhere between the two. This album is a veritable trip around the world of goth. Aside from that, we have, of course, the UK and various parts of the US, Norway, the Netherlands, Japan, and Spain, which is Hispanic, but not Latin American. Yay for weird and inconsistent US-based terminology. 8 countries, 4 continents right there. Anyways, I would like to highlight this particular album because it supports a very important cause, with the proceeds going to CUAV, Communities United Against Violence, a San Francisco-based organization that supports LGBT survivors of domestic violence. Unfortunately, it is hard to find organizations aimed at assisting LGBT survivors of domestic violence, even though survivors and perpetrators can be any gender or orientation. As a relevant note, if you are in the San Francisco area and need such services or know someone who does, I do have CUAV's website included in the description of this video for you to check out. Being connected to an LGBT-centric organization, I can also say that aside from being a very international album, I know that members of a good portion of the bands featured on this compilation are in some way LGBT, in case that's of interest to you. Well, I know there are some L's and some T's. Not certain about the G's and the B's specifically, but I'm also not an expert on all the members of every single band. It's 18 different bands, okay? Even if the ones that I know for sure don't have any members for whom that applies, I do know them to be LGBT supportive. Aside from supporting a good cause, how is this album specifically? I have specifically reviewed quite a few compilation albums here, and I think they're a good way to be introduced to multiple bands at once, and also I just think they're an important part of goth culture. How is this one? I would first like to mention that there are, I would say, 2 different types of compilation albums: the sampler and what we'll refer to as the soundtrack variety. The sampler variety is one that's a sampling of music by bands that fit the theme, which is usually something like bands from this country or bands who released music this year. Usually they're roughly the same genre, but there could be a great variety of subgenres. Like there'll be an ethereal wave song, a lo-fi post-punk song, and then an aggro-tech industrial song. There isn't necessarily a lot of thought put into the order, or it can only go so far because some songs are so different. It is made purely to introduce you to those bands, not really meant to be listened to in one sitting, and there's a good chance you'll personally not like all or even several of the songs. What I'm calling the soundtrack variety has a more cohesive sound, and that it sounds like it could be the soundtrack or the score even of a movie. There is minimal, if any, diversity in subgenre. Not that they all sound the same, they're just similar stylistically. And a lot of times, members of the bands are friends in real life, and if you know about one of them, you probably know about all of them featured. There's usually a lot of thought put to the order, and that's something that actually matters because usually none of the songs are so jarringly stylistically different they'll clash if they're next to each other. This particular album falls into the latter category, one of the only, possibly the first compilation album I have reviewed here to do so. Most everything on this album fits into what is now thought of as the deathrock sound, and with a few with that more bare-bones sort of post-punk sound. There are a few considered darkwave, but not the sort of side of darkwave that is essentially the whole dark disco sound that was so popular in the previous decade of goth, but using the electronic elements to give us that creepiness you can't get from a more organic instrument. So stylistically, the songs are pretty similar. The songs do not all sound the same, but they do go well together. Those of you who know my personal taste will know that deathrock is my favorite genre, and I honestly consider myself more of a deathrocker than a goth if we're being really specific, so as far as my personal tastes go, I do like this whole album a lot. I personally had already been following multiple bands featured on this album and have seen a few of them live, some on the same nights. The most different in terms of sound is probably the song by the Gaetane Demone Quartet, which is kind of funny because she's thought of as one of the original death rockers, and I guess that shows how much the perception of death rock has grown. It still very much fits, though. Speaking of original death rockers, I have mentioned the diversity of countries featured on this album. There's also diversity in ages. We have bands like Alter Fe and Phaida that started in the early 1980s, all the way to bands like Shrouds and Yamauba that made their first release within the past few years. The bulk of the bands featured began in the 2010s, but they come from every era between the 1980s and now. It's not just young whippersnappers, but it's not just the oldies either. I would say get it if you have musical tastes like mine. If you like literally any of the artists on this compilation, you'll probably like most of them. Also, it supports a good cause. If you do want to get yourself a copy, be it physical or digital, I have the link in the description below. If you want more information on goth music from Latin America, usually my specific focus, though not today, I invite you to subscribe and check out my other social media links in my link tree, also linked below. Thanks for watching. Bye now.